fellow Agner. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of the Future of Agriculture podcast. My name is Tim Hamrich, and I don't usually do this. I'm releasing a second episode this week because I did this interview this week, and I just thought it's so timely and relevant that I need to get this one out the door into your ears as soon as I possibly can. Today we're talking about fertilizer, and more specifically the fertilizer economics right now, the supply and demand of what's going on around the world when it comes to especially nitrogen products and also phosphate products. This market, if you've been watching it at all, you know, is definitely volatile, to put it lightly. There's a lot going on in geopolitics, and it really is impacting farmers who are getting ready to plant crops for the most part here in the United States. And so I wanted to bring on StoneX Group's Vice President of Fertilizer, Josh Linville, who really is an expert when it comes to fertilizer. If you follow him on X, you know this. He's very active and provides a lot of great insight into what's happening in the fertilizer markets. In a small world situation, Josh and I used to work on the same trade floor at Bruce, almost 20 years ago now, me on the grain side and him on the fertilizer side. But he really has a wealth of knowledge when it comes to what's happening in fertilizer. And right now, it's a big deal happening for the future of agriculture and the present of agriculture, quite frankly. Anyway, before we get into it here, a bit of background on Josh. Growing up in northwestern Missouri on a family farm growing tobacco crops and cattle, Josh brings a unique perspective to the fertilizer markets. With over 20 years of experience in this industry, Josh has operated in roles that have given him market perspective as a North American logistics specialist, US-based nitrogen producer, and general manager of commerce in Melbourne, Australia. Josh and his team, which span the globe, have worked hard to educate the market on how to use the fertilizer futures markets to not only offset price risk, but also to be able to sell produce to farmers much sooner for fertilizer producers to start their physical sales program. I definitely think this one is very relevant to anyone thinking about the future of agriculture. And we might get into a little bit of trader talk, but I tried to keep it as accessible for anyone, even if you've never traded in these markets, because I think it's really important. Anyway, enjoy this interview with Josh Linville.
The fertilizer market is still one on the retail sector. It is very much an old school, older generation, flat price risk marketplace. You buy the fertilizer and you hope the farmer comes in to pay for it, or you hope the market goes up in price. It's a lot like what the grain markets were back in, say, like the 60s, 70s, when elevators weren't trading grain. They didn't know how to use it as a hedge mechanism. The fertilizer is still back in those days. So we're trying to kind of teach them and say, hey, we can use these futures markets in order to hedge those physical risks. Take this spring, for example, right? We've got nitrogen phosphate prices insanely high. Farmers are refusing to commit, but the retailer knows I have to have this product in place, but I'm scared to death of the price falling to the floor. So we're saying, okay, let's go look at trying to sell May, June urea paper against these positions. If the price does start to fall down, yeah, we're going to lose our shorts on the physical side, but we make it up on the paper side.
Mm-hmm. And is liquidity and the kind of convergence on the fertilizer futures markets, is it pretty in line with the cash market and the needs of the cash traders?
Yes and no. Liquidity has been improving significantly so here recently. There's a lot more attention on the fertilizer market, given everything that's going on, the price risks that everybody's seeing. It's getting a lot more attention from the marketplace. But to compare it against like a corn, for example, that trades 10 times over what's actually produced? Nowhere near that. I think total, we're probably looking at 4 or 5 million tons traded on the future side, probably equal parts on the OTC side. It does not trade on the CME Central screen. It utilizes a lot of voice brokers and things like that. It's just, again, even the progressive part of the fertilizer market is still kind of utilizing some of the past technologies, if you will, which it's fine. It works very well. And the folks in that space do an incredible job. But it's just, it's got its own nuances, like everything in fertilizer.
I see. Yeah. And what about domestic supply of nitrogen products? I mean, we got the Haber-Bosch system. It's been around a while. Do we have enough kind of Haber-Bosch production facilities domestically? And if not, why not?
So anhydrous, yes, we produce almost all of the anhydrous here in country that we need. UAN, again, yes, we do import a little bit, but for the most part, we produce almost all of what we need. Urea is our shortfall. This year, our fertilizer year 2026, which runs from July 25, June 26. We think we need about 5.1 million tons of imports to meet what our demand is ultimately going to be. That is our biggest shortfall. That is the one we're most concerned about because we are ahead of schedule as far as our imports through March. In April, May, if it were normal years, it'd be a layup. It'd be a piece of cake to get these imports coming. We only need like 1 million ton. This is not a normal year, right? 1 million ton may be hard to find over a 60-day period. And yeah, to your point, we've got plentiful gas out there. We've got the demand that's here. And people sit there and say, well, environmentally, we don't want to produce it here. We can produce it cleaner than the rest of the world. So we absolutely ought to be looking at doing that. But it's so cost prohibitive on the initial financing that nobody wants to step in. If you've got $3, $4, $5 billion to build a new nitrogen plant, there's better investments with that money.
I see. So where is the urea imported from traditionally?
Traditionally speaking, and again, this year not being traditional, about half of those imports come from the Middle East, and 25% of that comes from Russia. And the rest of that 25% gets sparsed out to the rest of the world.
I see. Yeah, and it starts to put the pieces together about why it's priced the way it is, given the global situation.
Yeah, one of the things, and I always try to preface this on, it's going to sound crazy. Our price is cheap. And people listen to that and they're like, I don't know what you're talking about. I've looked at my price. It's not cheap. What I mean by that, though, is our price versus the rest of the world. So we spend a lot of time talking about NOLA, New Orleans, Louisiana. That is, I always say it's kind of like an SAT question. NOLA is to fertilizer as Chicago is to corn. That's our base point. That's what we watch. That's all the liquidity. That's where all the pricing comes from. And so a lot of times we will look at, because half of our flow comes from the Middle East, we look at that price differential. We look at the Middle East price plus vessel freight, convert it to short ton, throw it onto a barge, the cost to go with that. And then we compare that price line to where our NOLA price is. And normally this time of year, we're moving anywhere from even money to say a $20 ton premium to that economics. Today, we're $60 to $70 cheap versus those economics.
Why would we be under the market?
I think part of it is we have done very well. When you look at our imports, July 1, 25 through March, and this is a lot of those months all the way through January, that's U.S. Commerce Department information. So that's about as good as it gets. And then February, March, some of these vessel tracking forecasts and things like that, pointing to a very heavy import lineup. Again, we said we needed about 5.1 million. We think July through March, we think that number sits at about 3.8 million. You typically throw 300,000 ton in June because it's too late. It's a summer fill month, so you don't worry about that. But that takes our total up to 4.1 million. We only really need 1 million ton for April, May, and that's not very many tons for that period. So I think the market is sitting there saying demand has been very slow. The farmers aren't buying, so the retailers aren't buying. And it looks like imports are ahead of schedule. We're worried we might start killing demand if people start switching from like corn over to beans, for example. We don't feel like we need it right now, but that can shift very, very quickly. If all of a sudden, India tenders and the whole market starts to take off, we're going to be forced to move back in line with the rest of the world. If April imports continue to not show up on the list, we're going to have to start moving up. We're going to start fighting for those tons to finish out our spring season.
Okay. So essentially, it's the sellers are getting ahead of what they're seeing out there is the reason why they would sell it at a discount. It's not replacement value.
Well, that's the thing. It's the normal market is trading at that discount today. For whatever reason, the sellers of the positions out there are content selling at that price. Personally speaking, I kind of scratch my head on it. I don't quite understand the what and the why, other than they're just worried. I think there's a lot of long positions in the marketplace. I think people are sitting on a lot of material they made a lot of money with. And sometimes in the market, let's face it, you and I have lived a life where there are times where you can sit there and say, yeah, I could squeak out a little bit more, but at what cost and what risk? Is it better just to sit there and say, listen, at this point, I'm willing to sell at the discount to make sure I make the sale, make sure I make the profit and make my year? That could be what a lot of people are doing and saying, if it's going to rally, let's just say the $70 a ton increase just to get back in line with the world, let somebody else deal with that. I want no part in it. I want to take my chips to the window. I want to cash out and I want to go home happy.
Yeah. And what about the kind of global S&D of urea? Is it pretty stable in terms of what we're producing, and just you've got these sort of kind of global conflicts and economic situations that are causing the price volatility?
Yeah, it's massive globally speaking. And once you start to dig into the numbers, it really starts to show itself. And listen, urea was not in good shape before the war started. Everybody's talking about what happened after we struck Iran. What happened? I think it was February 28th when that happened. Well, what happened since that point? It's like, listen, we were in bad shape already. Back in late 2021, Europe had basically told Russia, take your cheap natural gas and shove it. We're not going to take tons off the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. They continued to go back and forth, and eventually Russia just shut off the pipeline. And then somebody blew the thing up. And European production, nitrogen production, which they were always self-sufficient, it dropped significantly. Now, fortunately, free markets have come back and they've gotten their prices lower. but they are still about 75% of normal operating rates. That's a 3.5 million tons on an annualized basis shortfall. China is typically one of your biggest exporters of urea. The government had come out late last year, late 25, and said, listen, we're not going to export fertilizer until August of 26. That is 5 to 5.5 million tons, again, annualized, that's missing from the world. And that's before the war even started. So now all of a sudden, you attack Iran, the Strait of Hormuz shuts down, you lose 3 of the world's biggest exporters of urea, Qatar, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. That's 13.5 million tons that's suddenly missing. And now it's spreading. Now all of a sudden the story's moved beyond the strait. Now all of a sudden it's like LNG exports aren't going. Well, India, who produces 30 plus million tons per year, they can't get enough gas coming in. Their production rates are heard to be around 50, 60, 70% of normal. That's a massive loss. North Africa's had production issues because gas supplies have been low. So it's a story that continues to expand like all the other markets have, right? Oil is expanding, gas is expanding, sulfur is expanding. Fertilizer, it's doing the same thing. It started in the little corridor. It's starting to build out the longer this conflict goes on.
And so that just seems to kind of concentrate the bargaining power into the hands of like China and Russia, it sounds like.
Yeah, absolutely. They're able to sit there and ride the wave up, and they're continuing to see their production costs not really change a whole lot, similar to what North American producers are doing. The gas cost here has not changed significantly, but the cost of their finished good, because of all these global things going on, continues to rise. So from their standpoint, it's the best thing that could have ever happened from a profitability standpoint. I don't think a lot of the folks working for those companies are enjoying this. It makes for a lot of hard conversations. But when it comes down to the end of the day, the financial side of it is going to be booming.
Well, we got a lot of people listening to this podcast that have not, been day to day in the fertilizer markets for whatever 20 plus years you have. They might be thinking, okay, isn't nitrogen? Why is urea so special? Why don't we just use, different forms of nitrogen that maybe we can produce more of here domestically?
Yeah. And listen, at the end of the day, UAN, which should be a premium on a price per pound of N, has actually been a little bit of a discount. That should not be the case. And my worry is for those farmers who can switch from urea to UAN, there are a bunch of them that can, they're going to do that. The finances this year are terrible for the farmer, and they're going to look at any path forward to save money. And right now, switching from UAN or urea to UAN is going to do that. But what happens to the UAN market is all this demand starts to flow it into it. It's going to start to raise that price. It's seeing a lot of demand pop up, and it's only got a limited amount of supply. That price now rises. The biggest opportunity for the farmers, honestly, anhydrous. It's not cheap. Again, let me reiterate, none of these prices are cheap, but anhydrous is dirt cheap versus UAN. It is stupidly dirt cheap versus urea. If Mother Nature would let these guys get going, I think you'll see a run like we've never seen on the anhydrous side. But again, that's going to help build that price. And it's going to bring everything back in line. That free market S&D always does that, right? It controls the market. It sets the price. But right now, it's just a disconnected market until we get out in the field to get going.
Right. And then, in theory, of course, markets are dynamic and a lot will change between now and then. But in theory, that anhydrous price goes back to kind of parity on a per unit nitrogen, or however you would describe that as a fertilizer trader. And so does UAN. And then we blow through these inventories on the urea, and we might be looking at getting back in line with the world market, which right now we're $60 to $70 a ton cheaper than.
Yeah. And that's what we're watching for. We're waiting for that next demand wave to really come. And unfortunately, the calendar's working against us, right? We're late into March. We are, at least around here at home, north of Kansas City for our farms, we're planting in 2 weeks. The time is out. The calendar is working actively against us. We don't have the time to wait these things out and see what happens.
Yeah. Well, I mean, outside of the ability to kind of alternate between these different nitrogen products, in the grain business, we always just say like the cure for high prices is high prices. Do you see that in fertilizer? Do you get to the point where it's like, look, fertilizer is too expensive. Nobody wants to buy it anymore. It kind of seems like that's far-fetched given how important it is to farming.
Right. But I think you're going to see some of that. We've heard a lot of farmers who have been talking about, listen, I normally do a 50-50 rotation, 50% corn, 50% beans. Again, I'm talking from personal experience. That's what we do. This is the year. If you don't already have your nitrogen, your phosphate, your potash, and all these other inputs locked in, this may be the year you sit there and say, listen, I don't have the cash flow to produce 50% corn because of what it costs with everything out there. I'm going to have to scale back. I'm going to have to go 70% beans this year and only drop it down to 30% corn. I think that's a big thing. I think you've got some folks who are like, listen, I can't switch it to beans. I've got to stay on my 50-50, but I'm going to look at cutting back my phosphate application rates. I'm going to look at cutting back some of the nitrogen. I understand that by doing that, I am limiting my yield potential, but either because my checkbook says it, my banker says it, or maybe just the economics of the field says, listen, you don't always have to go for maximum yield. You can cut it back and that's more profitable. I do think high prices are going to cure high prices. Unfortunately, I don't think a lot of that's going to be seen until later spring.
I see. Yeah. Well, you talked about how these problems go back a lot further than the end of February, whenever kind of the Strait of Hormuz was closed. But what impact has that had? What impact specifically does the conflict with Iran, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, have on fertilizer prices?
Yeah, and again, we're going to talk NOLA, right? Because again, that's the easiest place to find it. Your urea barges before this thing happened, it was in the upper 400s. I want to say it was, I looked a couple days ago, it was 473. I think it was the last trade the day before the attacks began. Today, the highest price we've seen trade, $695. So we're up over $200 a ton, and that's NOLA. The scary thing is that doesn't take into account the basis that we've started to see blow out, because all the farmers have been waiting, rightfully so. I don't blame anybody for doing it, but they've been waiting and taking a just-in-time demand model. The retailer, not having the farmer step up and buy it, are saying, I'm going to wait. And that's fine. And a lot of times, just-in-time demand can cause prices to fall. But in this case, I'm afraid what we're doing is we're getting back into a corner, and suddenly we're going to start paying just-in-time logistics. Very expensive, not as timely as you might want them to be. And so we're talking about the price of urea jumping $200 a ton. The inland prices might jump up significantly more than that just because of paying that logistics to pay more trucks, to pay more rail, to pay more barge.
So yeah, you might be saving a little bit on the product, but because you need it right now, you're just paying fire sale prices or hair on fire prices for the logistics you need.
Yeah. We've both lived the life that we know that when all of a sudden you get to a situation, you got to have something tomorrow, the market knows it, and the market's going to make you pay for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Very interesting. Well, my next question in my head is like, okay, of this price jump from, 470s to high 600s, how much of that is sort of rumor versus fact? The old adage of like, buy the rumor, sell the fact, right? How much of it is just emotional reaction to the news versus the actual underlying fundamentals shifting? It sounds like with the Strait of Hormuz, it's a fundamental shift.
Yeah. I would say almost every single dollar of the price increase is fundamentally based. And in fact, now you start to go into $695. That's, like we were saying, significantly cheaper than world replacement. So that's actually a discount to what it should be. We should easily be up another $50 a ton just to get in line with the rest of the world. And there's a case to be made. Again, a lot of people draw on the correlations to 2022, as they rightfully should. It's a great correlation to talk about. We are in a worse fundamental state today than we were in 22, and our prices are nowhere near what they were back then. NOLA urea barges topped over $900 a ton back then. And we haven't touched $700 a ton here yet. But the fundamental S&D today is much worse. And again, a lot of that has to do with the grain price. You look at the price of corn and everything else out there, these farmers are not making money. At least in 2022, they're enjoying some high grain prices. They can help offset the high fertilizer costs and the high, diesel and the high chemical and all the other stuff out there. If you're making more money overall, this year they're dealing with the high fertilizer price and low grain prices.
So the only kind of like potentially, bearish news we're hearing there is just that, like, hey, farmers aren't making money, so they're not going to plant something that's going to require all these nitrogen needs. Have we seen them make such a shift this late in the process before? Have we seen that where it's like, okay, I am going to go to 70% beans in late March because I can't afford this?
I would say no. And there are some people that are challenging the ability of the market to do it. There is saying I'm going to make the change, and there's actually doing the change. And I think what they mean is, number one, if you've already applied the nitrogen to the field, you're sticking with corn. Doesn't matter, right? The nitrogen's there. You're going to go ahead with that process, but you've probably done that at a much cheaper price. The limiting factor might be the seed availability. We know there's only so much seed. There's only so much soybean seed that's out there. Not everybody in the world can all of a sudden just jump from corn straight to it. At some point, there's going to be a constraint where it's like, I either don't have it, it doesn't exist, or again, you go back to logistics. I don't have it in the right place. It's going to cost this much more to get the seed in time. It's going to take this much longer to get the stuff to arrive. So the market is built for a certain approach, and it's not built for a massive shift right before spring season. It's not built for that in fertilizer and chemical and seed, in any of these things. It's built for a normal approach.
This makes it seem like kind of an unprecedented situation. And maybe everyone just plants as normal and, bites a bullet and pays what they want in fertilizer. Do we have any sense of like how many people are in that situation you described earlier, which is you're this late in the game, you haven't locked in your needs because it always felt too high, and now it feels really too high, and you just have to bite the bullet and do it. Do we have any sense of like how many might be in that situation?
I don't know. It's impossible to know those kinds of numbers. There's no official data for that. The best you can do is have conversations across the nation as we do. And even then, it's conversation, right? And sometimes emotion can drive that conversation. So all to sit there and say, unfortunately, there's no great way of knowing it. It's one of those things, like a lot of the things in these industries, we'll know when it's far too late. We'll know that answer come summertime.
Okay. Oh, man. Well, so what's the path out of this, I guess? What do we see as resolving some of these tensions here? I mean, obviously, if we were able to open back up the Strait of Hormuz, that's going to have an impact, but it doesn't sound like it's going to solve all our problems.
No. And that's the biggest thing. Everybody's always like, well, what's the best case scenario out of this whole thing? Well, the best case scenario was that the Strait opened yesterday. That didn't happen. The next best case is that it opens today. That doesn't look likely. The next best case is tomorrow. So we're sitting there talking about the best case scenario is literally it reopening immediately. But think through again the logistics of it. We always look at it from our hometown, our back porch. But think about this on the global scale. If the Strait opens tomorrow, well, first you got to convince all these vessels it's safe to sail. You're not going to get attacked. You're not going to get blown up. That's going to take a minute. Second, you think about some of the attacks that we've seen. Qatar and Iran both had their some of their gas plants destroyed, right, by missile and drone attacks. Both of those nations' attacks were centered on the plants that feed their nitrogen production facilities. Now you're talking about repairs. That takes a while. Once you get that going, you've got to get LNG, you got to get natural gas production back up and running. Once that starts getting the fertilizer plant, you got to restart the fertilizer. And then ultimately, this is the thing that's really going to take time. The Persian Gulf, the Middle East, is designed for a steady flow of incoming and outgoing vessels. It is not designed to load hundreds of vessels all at the same time. So when you think about it, what does it take to load a vessel? You got to park it, you got to tie it off, you got to open it, you got to load it with 30, 40, 50,000 tons. You got to close it, untie it, push it back off. It's a 24, 48 hour period at best. And there's only so many spots at these ports to do that in. So there's going to be a backlog of vessels just waiting to go in. And what you're going to see is, I think, and again, this is all theoretical. We've never seen this before. I think we'll get into a marketplace where it's like, great, you have an April loading. Let's just say, for example, when in April? Is it actually going to load? Do you have the loading slot or do you just have a roundabout? It's going to turn into a market where it's like, my loading slot is April 22nd. What will you pay me for that vessel? My loading spot is May 3rd. What will you pay me for that spot?
Well, so that creates another question I have, and I'm not trying to incite unnecessary panic here, but do you see risk of people who do have their fertilizer needs locked in, unable to get it logistically when they need it because maybe somewhere in the value chain, someone's taking advantage of these high prices right now and saying, hey, I'll ship this vessel that I had going to NOLA. I'm going to ship it to you because I can get a huge premium for it. And could that affect people who do have their fertilizer needs locked in?
I would say yes, it's always a possibility, but I don't expect to see that happen. The market's done a very, very good job of being conservative this time run up. You've not seen anybody really getting out over their skis, at least from our point of view. And ultimately, I think everybody's been very responsible of making sure if I sell it, I make sure I can confirm the sale, make sure I follow through. Now, there have been some conversations we have heard, like domestically speaking across the Midwest, where the force majeure conversation has popped up. I don't think we'll actually see those play out because, again, I think everybody's been making sure the product that's coming is what they're selling. But I can never sit there and say, yeah, it absolutely won't help. I mean, we've seen weird things in the past.
Right. Well, does this kind of run up in prices and 22 wasn't that long ago. So, twice in not too long. Does that change sort of the economics of looking at building more manufacturing facilities here in the U.S., or is it still far-fetched that could be in the future?
I would say there's a better chance now than we've ever seen. I don't know that you'll see the current manufacturers do it. If they were going to do it, I'm surprised they haven't until this point. But the reason I'm more hopeful is you're seeing a lot more attention on the fertilizer market from places like politicians in Washington, D.C. I'd say 2 years ago, if you'd gone to any politician and started talking fertilizer, they'd glaze over and not have a single clue what you're talking about. Today, it's being talked about on every news cycle out there. Everybody knows about fertilizer now. And they're starting to learn that, listen, we are still dependent on these imports. And our imports come from Russia and the Middle East. And it's a little bit of a head scratcher knowing what our demand is, knowing what our gas supply is, knowing what our cost structure is. And so I'm not going to sit there and say I guarantee you we're going to see a new plant built, but I think this is the best chance that we're going to have at building new production capabilities to reduce our reliance on the rest of the world. And even if we do produce it, let's say we produce every ton that we need here in the US, that does not mean our price does not ebb and flow with the world price. It absolutely is going to, but it puts us in a much safer point for the next generation of farmers.
Right. Yeah. Well, switching gears a little bit, what about phosphate? That's mined and not manufactured, so it's not like we could just build a facility for it, is my understanding. What's that looking like in terms of the current global market?
This is going to be hard to stomach. Phosphate's more spot than nitrogen is. So when you look at the phosphate market, look at it globally. There are just 5 countries that control, we think, 85 to 90% of exports of production. Number 1 on the list is China. Normally, before 2022, they export something between 8 and 10 million tons per year. Easily the biggest manufacturer and exporter in the world. But this year, same thing as urea, they are not going to export until at least August. And frankly, the way things are going, I don't think we'll see them in August. So your biggest supplier is gone. Number 3 on the list is Saudi Arabia. Congratulations, you're stuck behind the strait. You can't export anything right now if you tried. Number 5 on the list is the US. Our operating rates of phosphate production have been bad. I was trying to say meager, but that's not a right term. It's been very bad, near record lows here the last few quarters. And then once you expand it out, again, now that's just the ones that are being directly impacted. Now, when you start to look out, 2 of your biggest variable costs for phosphate production is anhydrous and sulfur. Because of the strait being closed, 3 of your top 10 global anhydrous exporters are stuck behind the strait. So they're not coming out. That incredibly tightens up the global anhydrous market. And again, I'm not going to sit there and say I knew this information. Thank you for Google on this. But according to Google, when you ask how much of the global sulfur comes from the Middle East, half of it. So now all of a sudden, 2s and 4s, Russia and Morocco, or Morocco's number 2, Russia's number 4, these 2 nations are seeing their cost of production go up significantly, and they're having to fight to find these inputs.
So this is, I didn't know this. In order to generate phosphate, you need anhydrous and sulfur. Wow. So with those 2 things seemingly hard to find, extremely expensive, even with phosphate levels having rallied, it's still maybe not a no-brainer for these companies. I'm surprised to hear that the U.S. production is down the last few quarters.
Yeah. In fact, it's been down since spring of 21. It used to be if we dripped down to a 75% operating rate, that was cause for alarm. There was something big that happened because it dropped it down that much. Since 2021, we've hit 75% 1 quarter. It's been struggling for a while. And again, I mean, a lot of our phosphate production is based in Florida. And that phosphate rock quality that they have access to has been getting poorer and poorer. Everybody's like, well, why don't they expand? Well, look at Florida. Everybody's moving there. Neighborhoods continue to grow. And nobody wants to be backed up to a mine. And then once you start looking at it from that standpoint, I mean, Florida runs on tourism dollars, right? It's people going to the beach. It's people going to NASA. It's people going to see Mickey Mouse. Mining of phosphate rock does not even enter the conversation as far as income flow. So it's not an important thing to them. And they've really been hemmed in, not only from the population, from the government, even the environmentalists. Of course, they're fighting them tooth and nail, making sure they don't get to expand out from where they're at. So, yeah, we've been struggling for quite a while. And there's continued hope that that rate will get better. But at some point after years of this happening, I don't know at what point we just sit there and say, we've got to start thinking about 100% is no longer 100%.
And you said something really interesting earlier about okay, even if they open up the Strait of Hormuz, is everyone going to be confident that it's safe? And it reminded me of some of the kind of Peter Zion thoughts that we've talked about here on the show of are we ending the era of globalization and everybody's just a little bit too protective to really trade globally? And I wonder, that seems to it could have a massive impact on the fertilizer market.
Yeah, absolutely. And start to branch out, right? If you look at it, can we produce our own nitrogen? I think the answer is yes. I think we can become self-sufficient on our own nitrogen production. Phosphate, we can't. Unfortunately, again, you look at that phosphate rock quality, the amount that's still left down there, I don't think we can live long-term with just our own supplies. We need to be partnering with global partners to get our hands on the supplies. Potash. We produce very little of what we actually use here, but fortunately, we have the biggest manufacturer of potash just to the north. So if we just maintain good relations with Canada, we're perfectly fine. And I know what these folks talk about. They're like, oh, we're going to start to hem up. We're going to start to put up the borders. We're just going to focus on our own. We don't survive that way. We need the world. There are things that the world has that we don't, and we have things the world doesn't have. There needs to continue to be trade. That's how we continue to get better further away. But I think we do need to look at where do some of these supplies come from. We've been talking for years, our dependence on the Middle East in terms of nitrogen. And if anything ever happened, what would that would mean? Unfortunately, we're living those days. We're living the warnings that we've had out there for years. I think we need to have a hard look and say, like computer chips, where do they come from? Is that a reliable source? These precious metals, can we continue to source it from China, or is that something we need to start looking around the rest of the world?
Yeah, it seems like China has been way ahead of the curve on that. I know I spent a little bit of time in West Africa, and the Chinese presence there, because of the natural resources, was mind-boggling. And it seems like we've kind of been behind on that, almost a little bit complacent.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that has to do with it's a different strategy approach. When it comes to the U.S., let's face it, our focus changes every 2 to 4 years with the election cycles. It doesn't do that in China. Those guys are looking at things from a decades-long strategy. And a lot of times you look at like right now, they're probably not really pushing as hard as they had because they're looking at Trump and saying, okay, this isn't one I want to push against. I just got to wait 3 years. Next president, I might be able to push a little bit harder than what I could with him, or maybe it'll be worse. But I am looking at this from a decades-long, centuries-long of a strategy approach. We don't know what we're doing every 24 months.
That's very true. It's very true. Well, and this may be far-fetched, but the show's called Future of Agriculture, so I'm just curious if you see any potential here. A lot of this kind of fertilizer ends up in manure, right? Animal manure, people manure. Is there any hope of like technology that can help us sort of recycle it a little bit better than we do currently?
At the end of the day, those types of things, at least from like the animal manure, that's something you can kind of count on because you know exactly what is going into those animals, right? So you're not getting surprises on the stuff that's coming out of it. The unfortunate part is it's a finite asset. It's a finite product. And people will point to it and say, oh, I'm just going to go with this. And again, it's one of those things that's like, well, if every farmer goes to buy the manure, there's not enough to go around. It's already going to the field. So I don't think there's anything that can really increase the nutrients of it. It's just what it is what it is. There have been some studies on like human. How do you pelletize that and put it out there? But the problem is, who knows what chemicals are coming out of that source, all the drugs and the prescription, everything that people are taking. Well, now there's a big worry about, well, if we put that into something that's a fertilizer and we put it on the field, well, number one, there's just the human aspect. It's icky is probably the best word for it. But there's a lot of drugs and chemicals in that stuff that farmers don't want in the dirt and that we don't want in the crops being grown in that dirt. So unfortunately, I don't think the human side of it's something we can really look into. Like I said, there's been projects, there's been studies on it. It's just one of those I really scratch my head and say, I don't see a path forward here that we're real comfortable with.
Man, this has been just an enlightening conversation, Josh. I really appreciate it. Before I let you go, is there anything we didn't talk about that you want to add or something we did talk about that you just want to emphasize before we close out?
The biggest thing, and again, this is just to those farmers who are just scratching their head and like, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to proceed with it. And the biggest thing I always talk about, farm marketing, listen, we can be angry, sad, upset, nervous, all these negative emotions. The market is causing that to happen. We still got to have a clear head when it comes to farm marketing, right? Clear, rational decisions. Clear, hopefully we can find some opportunity with profitable situations out there we can jump on. Don't let all those negative emotions cloud your judgment on this thing. And listen, my wife, if she was on here, she'd love to tell you all the stupid, angry decisions I made. Not a single one of them have ever worked out for me. In these operations, these farmers, I always tell them when I'm at an audience or something like that up on stage, most farmers' operations are significantly bigger and more valuable than most of the companies in this country. You've got to approach this thing like a CEO. And those CEOs, there's a reason they sit there and talk about their psychopaths or this or that. They can turn off that emotion very quick and just make a decision based on the data that's there. And I think we need to do a better job of it. The other side is, I know it's easy to want to bury our head in the sand. Again, those negative emotions. But if you're going to need stuff this spring, have the conversation with your retailer. I'm not saying you have to lock it in. I'm not saying you have to hand them a check. I'm not saying you have to price it. But have a conversation. How are you saying? Here's what I'm wanting to do. I'm wanting to go 50-50 rotation again. Here's what I'm thinking I need for fertilizer. That retailer may sit there and say, dude, I know that's what you're going to do. We've been working for years. I got you covered. Retailer may say, listen, I didn't buy it because I don't know what to do and I can't take the risk. I need to have a really good idea of what you're doing so I can make plans to have this stuff in place when you're ready to step in and give me the money to pay for the product. The more conversations we can have with our supplier, the better suited we are going to be to get through the spring with limited hiccups.
Well said. Josh, thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah, man, absolutely. Like I said, it's a trying time. 24 years, I've never seen it like this. I hope I never see it again. I'd love nothing more to get on all these again and sit there and talk about all the good things happening. That day will come.
Hopefully so. We'll bring you back on for that day.
I like it.
Thank you again to Josh Linville for being on the show. I'm sure after listening to him, you'll want to follow him on X, which I will leave a link for in the show notes. They also have a lot of YouTube videos that I'll link to as well. And you certainly want to be following StoneX if you're all interested in fertilizer education and especially fertilizer futures, which I can leave a link to their website there as well. So thank you again to Josh. Last but never least, thank you for your time and your attention. 2 episodes this week. So if you listen to them both, thank you especially for your time and your attention. I never take it lightly. I'll be back next week with another story of ag innovation.